So I met Chancellor Johnstone, I guess about 2 months ago, and he was telling me about some pioneering stuff he's doing at the Air Force, where his responsibility is to teach really the next generation of leaders and people inside the Air Force on the latest and greatest technologies. And so when he was thinking about what he should teach them, he thought, well, the future of machine learning is obviously federated learning. I better start teaching these folks all about it. And then luckily he came across Flower and started using it to help explain some of the principles. So he's flown over from the US to talk to us about some of the interests of the Air Force and this sort of technology that's sort of nascent, but building. And so with that, I'm happy to hand over to him. Thank you, Nick.
All right. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming and attending my talk. Today, I'm just going to be talking about exploration of federated learning in the United States Air Force with Flower. So specifically, this is sort of joint work between myself and Nathan Gaw, who you might have seen yesterday. He's since exited the country. I think he just got home safely. But this is kind of a conversation about a little bit of industry, the Air Force, and a little bit of academia, specifically the United States Air Force Institute of Technology. So in general, myself and Nathan, we are both assistant professors at the Air Force Institute of Technology. Specifically, I am also an operations analyst within the Air Force. So I sit kind of in a weird position where my time as an assistant professor is sort of capped, and I'll be transitioning somewhere else in the next couple of years. But this is sort of the team that we've kind of been exploring federated learning with. Off to the right was a presentation at Informs in the US. We have some current and former students. But really, the idea behind this presentation is I sort of found federated learning, as Nick stated, and I wanted to pursue research in it, but I found there was no really concrete formulaic approach to learning all the topics in federated learning. So it was a struggle to find a textbook. It was a struggle to find what I thought were helpful and sort of well-structured content. So I started to go and try and create my own in order to, one, support and augment all of these students and just push forward what I think is an important topic that the Air Force is currently, for lack of a better term, ignoring. So the course in general, designed to, one, supplement the current set of graduate level courses. So the Air Force Institute of Technology is a graduate institution, specifically for the Air Force, but we kind of cater to all members of the US Department of Defense, primarily for, only for master's and PhD graduate studies, putting out research as well. So the second was to, first was to supplement the current set of courses, but also prepare students and actually pursue graduate level work. So the course itself is kind of organized in this fashion. We sort of start off with machine learning preliminaries as one does, teaching them about different machine learning topics, maybe the differentiation between non-parametric, parametric methods, building it up. How do we optimize? How do we train those methods? A little bit of a discussion about different gradient descent approaches. We then get into a little bit of privacy preserving ML. We don't really focus on this, but we introduce this as, hey, this is an option if we have some sort of private data or set of private data that we need to consider or be considerate of, right? And all of these things have already been talked about, whether that be HIPAA, GDPR, anything like that. The US really doesn't have any formal laws associated with data protection. California has the CCPA, but it's more of public policy and sort of like ideological, this is what we should be doing as opposed to this is what you will do. We move into the sort of federated learning portion of the course after this, which includes aggregation strategies. We also talk about data heterogeneity, personalization, and then some of the things that aren't on this discussion are unsupervised federated learning. So this particular iteration of the course, we talked about federated PCA and federated k-means clustering as just a subset of those unsupervised approaches. We also mention and discuss adversarial federated learning and talk about things like an honest but curious server and all of these attacks that we can go forward and maybe from these gradients recreate data, stuff like that. The last piece is uncertainty quantification within FL. I think I've talked to a couple people about this, but I think this is really an underexplored part of federated learning right now. The idea being we can't just rely on predictions coming from models. We really need to understand how well that model is performing and maybe attach some probabilistic information associated with those predictions, maybe in the form of confidence intervals or prediction intervals. I think if I'm talking about what's actually done with UQ and FL, there's maybe like 4 papers that talk about it. So it is very, very underexplored. The course, again, is designed to sort of build up what I think are the main pieces of FL. So if you look at FL literature in general, it gets complex very, very quickly, right? And there are so many extensions, so many explorations. So the idea is to get these students started off and get them to a point where they're dangerous with FL, not necessarily changing the world with FL. Okay. So within the course, we do all of our FL in practice with Flower. So we kind of mentioned that there are other approaches for practical FL. I don't want to offend any of the other FL frameworks by not including you on this slide. I think I've learned about 7 or 8 just being here in the last couple of days, but we really utilize Flower just based off of the ease of implementation, its flexibility, and the fact that at the time of the construction of this course, it was the only framework I knew. So a little bit of convenience there. But we discuss construction of client server files and functions. How do we construct custom aggregation strategies, custom output, and then how to use the simulated server, and then constructing all of these explorations, extensions we see in various papers in Flower as well. One thing I also think is kind of interesting with this course is that we developed a course project, and this course project was utilizing embedded devices. So we actually constructed a federated pipeline connecting actual Raspberry Pis, so 6 Raspberry Pis. These are Model 4Bs loaded up with Ubuntu 20.4. We also outfitted them with cameras and actually did image collection with these Raspberry Pis in order to construct a human activity recognition classifier. This maybe is a different terminology than you might see with wearables. We're just determining, is there a human in the image or not, versus what is the image, what is the human doing, walking, running, using information maybe that you would get from a Fitbit or something like that. We also did labeling of the images, which we've also talked about is a difficult thing with FL. And so we're actually working actively to do self-supervised, semi-supervised learning, as well as active learning with this data set that we've constructed. One of the sort of undertakings with this project was actually connecting the Raspberry Pis. So they're geographically separated throughout Dayton, Ohio, collecting images. We needed to connect them in some fashion. So we actually used OpenVPN with a Raspberry Pi acting as a server, and all of them were able to communicate with this VPN. Really, this was the hardest part. Once this was all done, Flower was easy to implement once this was actually connected. So another emphasis on the ease of use for Flower with this topic. So this was the course itself. We're in the 2nd iteration of it. And so the actual presentation for final projects is the Tuesday I get back. So this was the project last year. This year, we're doing something a little bit different where the students are doing a sort of an initial exploration into their own thesis work, because this was actually a really difficult project for someone at this point who had no experience with Raspberry Pis, no experience with virtual private networks, anything like that. So I know we have experts in the room, but I'm ignorant to all of that. So if anyone can school me on this, that would be appreciated. So here are just some examples of these images we collected. So off to the left is an example of, with human activity, obviously, and off to the right, without human activity. That's actually me mowing my grass. So in order to collect these images and to get both positive and negative images for human activity, I had to take my dog on extra walks, right, to just make sure I was getting collected by our Raspberry Pi. Again, we can see they're geographically separated. We can also see that, there's a little bit of heterogeneity with these images. They're different locations. We also had images that were both indoor, outdoor. We have different lighting. We have different maybe distances to where in the field of view where the humans might be. So it's a nice example that actually includes practical heterogeneity in the data we collect, which I think makes it a more difficult, more interesting problem. So now the transition from the course into why the Air Force should, not necessarily currently cares, but why they should care about federated learning. So the United States Air Force actually has put a lot of emphasis on responsible AI. So the United States Air Force, as part of the larger Department of Defense, actually leads the way in responsible AI. And so they're actually emphasizing, coming from the United States Air Force Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, they're emphasizing responsible AI, and they have a responsible AI initiative, which includes these 5 principles. So anything that we construct, any machine learning, any AI, ideally should be responsible in some fashion, defined by these 5 things. So if we go and look at these 5 things and all of the lines of effort and all of the policy documents that are associated with these, data privacy as one item is emphasized over and over again in multiple lines of effort. Okay, so not explicitly talked about in these 5 principles, but definitely mentioned as we talk about, what do each of these things include. So the Air Force cares about this idea of data privacy, so which is inherently something we get in addition to combining all of these other privacy preserving machine learning approaches or privacy preserving approaches with FL. Other maybe pieces where we might care about federated learning and utilize it in the Air Force are sort of these examples. So we're talking about Internet of Things a lot today, right? Well, the Air Force and the Department of Defense, the United States Department of Defense, cares about this idea of the Internet of Battlefield Things, right? Which is the Internet of Things, but in adverse conditions. You can insert what adverse conditions might be, but we care about performing analysis. We care about inference on these Internet of Battlefield things. Okay, so immediately we could positively affect that with FL. Additionally, we have what we often do in sort of these adverse locations, adverse situations, is we have coalition partners, right? These are partners from different countries utilizing their information in some fashion to perform the mission, right? So often the method for sharing data or the actual process of sharing data is very clunky. It's very difficult. Information has to get downgraded. It changes. So there's a thought to say, and we could use FL within these respective coalitions instead of transferring the data, just perform FL with this coalition data, maybe each coalition as a client to actually get better results from our whatever machine learning task we're trying to perform. A second or third piece is intrusion detection for cybersecurity under the zero trust paradigm. And then one thing that I'd like to mention as well is just analytics with wearables data. So the Department of the Air Force actually includes the Air Force and the Space Force as a service. So on the Air Force side, in order to make sure that we're healthy and we can perform our job, we actually get tested physically every year. So it includes a run, push-ups, sit-ups, and then they actually measure your waist, your height, and get you a risk measurement at that with that. So I was at moderate risk the other day. So my wife was yelling at me, said, hey, you got to eat healthy. So the Space Force, though, they don't do any physical testing. They are starting a program with wearables where they do continuous monitoring of the Space Force members. And there's an assumption that they can take that information and identify whether or not they are being healthy in some fashion and whether they're physically fit. So if we have a wearable on every member of the Space Force, right, that's a lot of data associated with physical characteristics, physiological data. Seems like that could benefit from a federated learning approach instead of just collecting that data and having no sense of data privacy whatsoever. So moving forward, I think those would be good approaches for the Air Force and Department of Defense to emphasize, and that is my task going forward, is to emphasize these things as a subset of emphasis items. As far as the research that myself and the rest of the team is working on that is also of interest to the Air Force, we did some initial analysis on mild traumatic brain injury, MTBIs. We also are looking at multimodal FL with various physiological signals. So there's an effort going on by MIT to collect skin activity signals, respiration, heart rate to sort of determine cognitive workload for pilots. And so we're trying to apply a federated approach to that as well. This third bullet, I think, is a really interesting problem: federated scoring systems for healthcare diagnoses. So scoring systems are kind of opposite in the direction of these multi-million, billion parameter models, right? These are very sparse, very low number of parameters for these models, right? But they can still benefit from a federated approach. And these scoring systems are actually still very complex to get a good model. They have constraints on the number of parameters. They have constraints on the size of the parameters. So they're a difficult problem that we're working on as well. And all of these three here are relevant to the Human Performance Wing, which is also located in Dayton, Ohio, co-located with, neighbors of AFIT that deals with these sort of issues related to human performance. So think of human performance related to pilots, people on the ground, anything like that. Other projects include hierarchical FL, which I was talking to Daniel the other day that now I know about the driver API. It would have made it a lot easier to implement this hierarchical FL problem, but now we know and we can move forward with it. And then as well as self and semi-supervised federated learning pipelines. This is specifically a project that utilizes our image data set from the course, as well as some cybersecurity data as well. And that's it. I think I've exhausted my time here, but yeah, thank you very much for your time. Very much appreciated.
Thanks so much. That's a wonderful talk. Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. So one second, let's get the mic to you.
Hey, great presentation. I was curious, what drew you first to federated learning and then finding Flower? You mentioned a lot of the use cases, but I was wondering, was it responsible AI first, or was it more the specific use cases like the IoT that's going to be on the edge and the device?
Yeah, so I originally found FL because I was at another conference having to do with conformal prediction, which is a UQ methodology, and another federated learning team presented on federated learning. And so I didn't know what it was, knew what it was. And then I actually heard Daniel's interview with Practical AI, a podcast associated with artificial intelligence with Flower. And so it was my first initial identification that this was a framework that I could use to do this. And so it kind of then fit into saying, hey, this is a good idea because it fits automatically into this responsible AI framework.
So responsible AI is more the trigger, more than the actual AI.
Yes. And in general, we're trying to push that it fits into this responsible AI lens with the Air Force. And it's been, FL has been kind of, for lack of a better term, name dropped in a couple CDAO, Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office conversations about ways to be responsible with these machine learning tasks and training and data privacy and everything like that.
Great. Let's see, there's a question at the back there, and I guess we'll make this the last one, unless anyone's really into it.
Thank you. It's a really nice presentation. I remember you mentioned the adversarial kind of federated learning. Can you explain something like scenario, or you guys, because this is a kind of new research area, but I haven't noticed in this summit is like again, it's or the battlefield adversarial federated learning stuff is federated again. So is there any kind of specific
as far as
scenario about that?
As far as Air Force applications, yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely see potential for why we may be interested in it, just based on a sort of cybersecurity perspective. Even if we are protecting in some fashion, whether it be any of the, intrusion detection methods we've talked about or anything like that, we could still be robust to these situations if someone does get in our network, right? So we want to generate models that sort of are protected, but can be still provide us good models if we do have some sort of issues with different adversarial attacks per se.
So there's one more question online. So actually more, but I'll take one, which is the FL course only offered for US Air Force related members, or any person can apply for it?
So this is just purely for AFIT. Yeah, it's actually kind of an issue. I don't know. I think Nick, the course you constructed was the only other course I'd seen, but I heard someone else talking about a course that they'd gone through for FL. But yeah, this is just right now it's a special study for just people at AFIT, but I don't see why that shouldn't be changed, and there should be more FL courses available.
Yeah, I think probably there is a need for it. So I'd agree. So thank you for pioneering such stuff in such an important institution like the Air Force.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the talk.